everyone, and welcome to the virtual annual council meeting. My name is Janka Oertel. I'm the director of the Asia program here at ECFR. And you will be joining us for the session called A Europe Ready to Compete, EU-China Relations and the New Geopolitical Realities. 2020 was supposed to be the year of EU-China relations, with several high-level gatherings and potentially even the conclusion of a long negotiated comprehensive agreement on investment. After a pretty bumpy 2019, 2020 was planned to be about constructively moving forward. But as you all know, the plan got overtaken by events. Not only is there a global pandemic to deal with dire consequences for the world economy, but escalating confrontation between the US and China, with growing implications for trade and technology, is fierce. And the Chinese leadership's ever more assertive behavior at home and in its immediate neighborhood, as well as globally, now require a fundamental rethink of Europe's relations with Beijing. Over the last few months, we have witnessed Brussels and the member states trying to find a clear voice in this new geopolitical reality. The price is high. It is not only about the survival of the rules-based multilateral order, it is also very much about Europe's future competitiveness and prosperity from tech to trade, and about dealing with China's market-distorting approach to doing business. I'm delighted to be joined today by two amazing speakers to share their thoughts and answer your questions about where EU-China relations will be headed in the next few months. If we were on a normal stage, I would say to my left, you will find Margrethe Vestager, Executive Vice President of the Commission, responsible not only for making Europe fit for the digital age, but also for competition policy, with both portfolios inherently linked to the China file. And to my right, you will find Carl Bildt, who likewise needs no introduction in this group as ECFR co-chair, former Prime Minister and Foreign Minister of Sweden, prolific writer and universal foreign policy genius. After a brief conversation with our two fantastic speakers, it is your turn. Please already prepare your questions. If you want to come in, please click on the raise hand button in Zoom, and I will call on you as quickly as possible. If you want to write your question in the chat, that also works, and I will read it out. And if you follow our conversation via the live stream, please use the hashtag ECFR2020 to come in. So let's get started. Vice President Vestager, on the economic front, Europe is following a gradual but decisive approach that has now been ongoing for quite some time to deal with the challenges that China poses. The EU is clearly sharpening its defensive tools here when it comes to market distorting practices. We are debating a lot about how to level the playing field without putting our guards up just as high as China. So you've just published a white paper on foreign subsidies. What role do you think that white paper can play in this regard, and what's in it? Why did you publish it?
Well, thank you very much. Thank you for having me today. It's a great honor to be here with Carl Bildt, indeed. And thank you also for the timeliness of this debate. Last year, 14 months ago, we made a new EU-China strategy, which basically sort of retired the concept of China being a developing economy, a developing country, saying, well, China is a partner in some instances, but it's also a strategic competitor, both when it comes to their system and when it comes to competition as such, the market economy. So what we realized back then was that we did not have the necessary tools to defend fair competition. And fair competition gives us innovation, affordable prices, that the market serves the consumer and the customer. And that is something very fundamental that puts the individual in the center. And this is why it's important to protect and enforce fair competition. But in order to do so, obviously we have to stand up towards unfair competition that European companies are met with. And here, foreign subsidies in Europe is of the essence. Because in Europe, state aid is controlled, there's transparency, sort of the matrix we use is there in order to prevent distortion of trade. So it's not selective. And that very much is contrasted to the fact that we have no idea about the subsidies coming in when businesses are acquired by a state-owned or state-backed company from abroad, or when a company here gets subsidies, maybe the most harmful subsidies of all, which is subsidies to cover production cost. And with this white paper, where we suggest, specific tools developed with a view to enforcement, that, it can really work in everyday life. Of course, we hope to send a very strong signal that you're welcome to do business in Europe, but it has to be on fair terms. It cannot be that you come popped up with taxpayers' money from abroad. And I hope that signaling will work also to sort of underline the fundamentals about fair competition, and that it is part of our system.
So this is basically an offer to China to play game. It's not just for China. I mean, it's obviously addressed to every non-EU country, but with China, we have the biggest problem in this regard at the moment. What will we do if they don't take up that offer? How strong are the defenses that are inbuilt in the suggestions that you have made?
Well, sort of the ultimate is that mergers can be prohibited, that you cannot buy a company if we find that foreign subsidies are involved, or if it's an ongoing business, that the assets created with foreign subsidies will have to be shared, that knowledge will have to be shared, infrastructure will have to be shared. So we are suggesting, it's quite harsh consequences if we find that foreign subsidies are coming in to the Union to the detriment of European interests, that be jobs, that be competition and the level playing field. Because if it's security, issues of public order, here we have the screening instrument of foreign direct investment. So basically, right now we are sort of filling the toolbox, realizing, of course, that you cannot just have hammers. If you want to build a house, then you need hammers, screwdrivers, saws, some of them very, very efficient tools. And then at the same time pushing, of course, for reciprocity. Because part of the toolbox should also be that when it's public procurement, we don't want foreign subsidies either. Foreign businesses are welcome to compete in public procurements, but it cannot be that European businesses will have to compete against bidders who have foreign taxpayers picking up their bills. So it's I think about time being much more assertive and recognizing sort of the competitive strength of European businesses being able to compete on their own merits, while at the same time saying, well, now we want to see this competition at its full and not any risk of that being rigged because of foreign subsidies.
When we talk about competitive strengths, then it's natural to also talk about technology in Europe, because we do have a fear here that that's exactly what we're lacking in that regard, the technology angle. How do you see in the future Europe position itself in this increasingly fierce technology war that is emerging between the US and China beyond the competition dimension? What does Europe need to do to really be able to compete in this space?
Well, we have to fix some of the market errors that we see. Last year, we approved a giant and very important project of common European interest in microelectronics. We have approved a second one within batteries, where these are systematic issues. So it wouldn't make any sense for an individual business or just a few group of investors to tackle this issue head on, which is why we have sort of enablers to make a number of member states and a number of businesses coming together with quite massive public funding to solve some of these technological issues. And the second thing is, of course, to be much more precise as to what we will accept and what we will not accept. Take the 5G issue. Here, last year, under the leadership of Julian King, every part of the 5G value chain was evaluated and risks were assessed. And then 6 months later, we published the toolbox to enable member states to assess what risk are we going to take, what risk are we going to mitigate. And last but not least, in the digitization of Europe, it's very important to appreciate sort of the business-to-business technological strength that is really at the core, because that comes from that manufacturing capacity that is inherent in the European business fabric. And that is part of sort of the next chapter of digitization, that we have an in-depth digitization of all different sectors. And here, of course, that sort of business-to-business technological strength should be used at its full.
You have mentioned the 5G issue, and before I come to Carl Bildt, just because I'm curious, if you have 3 takeaways from the 5G debate that has been raging over the last 12, 18 months in Europe, what would be your 3 takeaways for Europe from that?
Well, first and foremost, that it has been a wake-up call with no snooze. That I think all of a sudden and at the same time, everyone realized that more was at stake here than speed in the rollout. Because the most important thing about 5G is, one, it's sort of the industrial backbone. So it's very important how we construct it. Second, that the security of that infrastructure is of the essence. Even though I am sort of promoting an open strategic autonomy, still, if we want to have any autonomy, well, we need to be able to control the technology. And last, but I think most important, if we do not work together, there's no chance that we will make this work. Because when it comes to technology here, we are only as secure as the weakest link. I know it's trivial, I know it's kind of banal, but again, this is the most important thing in a European context. It is for the European countries to come together with one approach to 5G, to our Chinese counterparts and partners for that matter. If we cannot master that, we will have no chance, no matter the technology, no matter the regulation. It must come from that inherent cohesion that we are creating at the moment.
Thank you, Vice President Vestager. We will come back to you in just a minute, but let me get in Carl Bildt here at this point. Carl, you recently called for a new realism when dealing with China, one between engagement and competition. But as Mark has said at the very outset of our gathering here, ECFR's recent polls have shown that there's a clear swing in public opinion against China. Parliaments are getting more and more involved, and simultaneously, China is showing no support on those issues that are really important for us on the partnership. So on climate change, ambition is low. On multilateral, and we see a pretty destructive attitude at the moment. So when we are now competing economically under the conditions of enhanced systemic rivalry with China, do you think cooperation is still possible? Or do we have to kind of set the cooperative agenda aside for the moment to focus on the competition part?
Well, cooperation has to be there. We share the same global challenges, and we need to establish global cooperation with all of the relevant actors. And the Americans being one, needless to say, the Chinese being others, Indians and whatever. We can't exclude any from the efforts that we are making in order to address global challenges. But let me also, since we have Margrethe Vestager here, just make one comment on the discussion that we had previously. And I support everything that was said, but with one important reservation. You don't win by playing only defensive. And I think the problem that we have in Europe is that we've been on the losing side of the game now for quite some time. Remember the Lisbon agenda? That's 20 years old. We haven't achieved it as of yet in terms of the same of the sort of fundamentals in order to be really competitive. For all of the discussion that we have now on the recovery fund, I would wish that we would focus on, say, 5 years ahead. Where is the US going to be? Where is Europe going to be? Where is China going to be? Now we see the European and American economy going back sort of 8-10% this year. China is still in the growth, whatever percent. So we see the gap between us and the Chinese are widening. And if we look at what are the foundations of strength is really innovation and entrepreneurship and the development of technologies. I just looked at the list of the top 100 unicorns in the world today. That is startup companies that acquire the market cap of $1 billion, more than 100 in the world today. 50 are in the United States. 26 are in China. And that's not state subsidies to a large extent. That is really entrepreneurship, because that exists side by side with what Margaret indicated, all of the subsidies. 10 are in Europe. 6 of those are in the United Kingdom. That's where we are. And these are the unicorns that are going to create the industries of the future, that creates our prosperity in the future, that decides where we're going to be in the global race. And here I think we need to be more honest in addressing some of our weaknesses. Go back to, we are now on Zoom. That's a startup in San Jose, California. We were very proud some years ago, not least Denmark, Sweden, Estonia, about Skype, which was one of the pioneers in these sorts of things. Even before that, Norway had something called Tandberg, which was way before everyone. Well, Tandberg was bought by Cisco. Skype was bought by Microsoft. We're out of the game because we don't have the climate of innovation. We don't have the depth of the capital markets necessary to support companies when they need to grow. Skype, Tandberg. And we don't have the single market as of yet to make it really attractive for them to see Europe as their home market. So yes, we need all of these defensive measures against China, against the US also to some extent, but primarily China, at the same time as we cooperate with China on the great global challenges. But we must start to play not only defensive but offensive in terms of our competitiveness, because otherwise playing defensive, you never win, you lose.
That's definitely, and I'm glad we're sticking to the football logic here. Lucas started it out well
Yeah,
with references to Jurgen Klopp.
it's not my strongest side, but I hope I'm correct.
The red thread running through the conversation here. But I completely agree with you that if you want to win, then you have to do shift into offense every once in a while. You said you were very skeptical about Europe's potential at the moment in the technology space to really be able to compete. I would like to bring in Margrethe Vestager here once again, and I would ask all of you, if you have questions, please go ahead and raise your hand and send them in the chat box, and I will be happy to distribute them to our speakers as well. But Margrethe Vestager, are you as skeptical? Are you as negative at the moment about the current environment? Because there's also some success stories that could be told. Europe is at critical junctures in the supply chain of basically any advanced high-tech product. Are we really as far behind as it seems?
Well, I think that is difficult to assess how far behind we are, because in some areas, obviously, since a lot of the business to consumer digital business is US or Chinese. In other areas, not so much. But it goes without saying that I completely agree with what was just said by Carl. We need a European capital market much more vibrant. And what we have been doing so far from the Commission side, Parliament and Council, is to have the legislation in place. But it's not enough to have the legislation in place. You need to put it in motion, and that is work in progress. And the same goes for the single market, because one of the reasons why one should not be surprised that it's Chinese and US giants that we see now is that they have a functioning single market, primarily or within a certain sort of language framework, cultural framework, that has made it much easier to gain sort of the sufficient strength to then roll out also in the very, very attractive European markets. And one of the things that is a recent improvement is the Single Market Task Force that we have formed with member states. We had basically, gone through everything to see, well, what are the barriers? And they are numerous, because the single market in a European context is like a lawn. If you don't maintain it, if you don't move it regularly, then in crawls, trees and weeds and what have you. And we really need to provide our businesses, our entrepreneurs, with a single market that really works. Because there is an ecosystem of innovation in Europe. You know, we see that Google and other tech businesses, they have a shopping spree in Europe. Great innovation, amazing entrepreneurs, and we should provide them with a capital market where people are willing to invest and with a single market that allows you to grow sufficient scale. And that is a top priority for us, because that is, I think, the least we can do when we ask European businesses and entrepreneurs to be more ambitious, to be more assertive about what they can do. And I think that is the test in the coming year. And it sounds so old school, that about the single market and capital. Yes, but these are the absolute necessities if we want to be successful in a very changing geopolitical context.
Carl,
No,
you also mentioned, yeah, please come in.
No, I completely agree with that. Just to take one concrete example, or another concrete example, 5G. 5G, we have two of the leading companies in the world. We can say that we are the Chinese, but we primarily are the technology leaders in the world. But we still find that we are years behind both the Chinese and the US when it comes to rolling out these technologies, because we have sort of fragmented and overregulated markets, and we don't have enough capital available to finance the rollout. So even in areas where I agree with that, we have the innovation, we have the technology, we have the brains. We need more R&D funding, in my opinion, but there are strengths that are significant. We find when it comes to really implementing these things, we tend to lag behind. And 5G is unfortunately a good example of that, where we have brains, the technology, the leadership, but we lose out anyhow. So in order to really compete with the Chinese, we need to start to play offensive, not only defensive. That's my main point.
Vestager, if Bildt is just saying, you know, we need the investment in 5G, in the recovery plan, is there an idea of having, you know, funds set aside for infrastructure development, funds set aside for especially the digital development of Europe? Because if we look what we're competing against, the Chinese stimulus package includes 600,000 base stations, 5G base stations by the end of the year, $2 trillion spent over the next 5 years on developing the digital infrastructure in the country. Have we set enough money aside for that?
Well, it's difficult to say if it's enough, and as we don't know how much it will be, because heads of state and government, they have not agreed, neither on the long-term budget nor on the recovery plan Next Generation EU. So I don't know if it will be enough, but the substance is clear, because we have set a course for this recovery to be green and digital, that the digital transformation must be part and parcel of what we do. Because there's no point in rebuilding the old world, because we want a new one. And we don't want to pay double, first to rebuild the old one and then make it green and then make it digital. And one of the things that we try to encourage member states to do is to make sort of a beauty contest when they auction the frequencies. So instead of saying, how much money as a telco would you give me to fill my state coffers, then instead ask, how fast and how complete can you make a rollout of 5G, so that you get the services and you get the use of technology, instead of translating sort of funds out of businesses into state coffers, then having politicians redistribute that in different support programs, where you could go much more directly the other way. But the tricky thing here is that we have this legacy all the way back from 3G, when it was, you know, the auctions brought in so much money that generations and generations of politicians remember this, of course, for understandable reasons, as the way to do it. But now we are in a very different context, because speed becomes of the essence. And the last thing is that we have to sort of to put our money where our mouth is, also when it comes to public tendering. To be able to see through if there are subsidies involved in tenders, to say, well, we want to use sort of all the quality criteria that we can put in the public tender, so that we get the qualities that we want. Because believe me, you always pay the full price. It may not be in cash or in money, but then you pay with something else. And I'm afraid that there has been a tendency that on the one hand side, of course, one would like to do something that was broad quality, maybe European, but when it comes to the financing of things, then cheap is still an amazing quality, understandably, because you answer to taxpayers. But we have to realize that there is, of course, a price to pay. But right now, we just pay another price, and you see it in this discussion, because the uncertainty that comes from not being sure that we are on the right track, that we're not in control of what societies we want to be, what economy we want to be, that is an enormous price to pay.
I have a number of questions now that are coming from our council members in the Zoom call, and I'm trying to navigate that simultaneously while looking at you and looking at the chat box as well. So let me just read a few of those questions, and then maybe we can pick a couple of them to end. So one is clearly linked to the conversation we just had. So what are the arguments against creating a pan-European 5G project, partly funded by the EU with Nokia and Ericsson? And a follow-up question that is, I think, directly targeted at Margrethe Vestager. If Alstom and Siemens would merge today, would they get the green light from the Commission now? Would the conditions be different? And a third question that I will throw out there, and then we collect more, is can a European super project, such as for microelectronics and batteries, be set up for European media and the public space? The biggest initiative in Europe is Google Digital News Initiative. Do we need something of our own? Who would like to start?
Well, I can start on the 5G consortium. That sounds like Franziska Brandner in the background, because that's one of her points of. The problem is, and Margaret had something to say, the problem that we have in Europe is that we have market fragmentation here. We have telcos all over the place that don't have the sufficient financial strength. China Mobile is huge. Verizon is huge. The biggest ones in Europe aren't that big. So it's not a question of public money, I think. There's enough of commercial viability in 5G. It's a question of market size and the regulatory harmonization that will create really unified space. There's an element of competition policy in this, needless to say, because previously, at least, the Commission had treated each national market as more or less separate, and that has, I think, contributed to this situation somewhat. So there are regulatory things that can be done. It's not a question of public money primarily.
Margrethe Vestager, would you like to add?
Yes, because it's not that we treat markets in a certain way. We assess markets. How does consumers and customers behave? And as long as you can turn to someone else, if your previous provider raise prices, lower quality, then the market is still growing. But the reason why telco markets in Europe tends to be national is because of regulation, culture and history. For very few people it would make any sense to have a subscription with a provider from another European country. You would get what your friends would find a very strange phone number, and you would be afraid of the cost. Of course, slowly but surely we may be getting there with sort of getting away from roaming, using other ways of communicating, so your phone number is not the first thing people see, but that still remains to be seen. But one thing could happen while this is ongoing, and that could be pan-European consolidation. Because it is indeed so that the European big ones, they are not as big as their US or Chinese counterparts. I think the biggest European telco is in 14 member states, where the big US telcos, of course, they are in every state. So we see that telcos are very focused on, indeed, these national markets, instead of focusing on how can we have a pan-European reach out. That would be what we could use as a backbone for bigger projects. On the second question on Siemens Alstom, I don't know if that could be approved today, because the reason why it couldn't be approved was that the companies wouldn't or couldn't solve the competition problems that arose from the merger, because most of the merger was perfectly fine. There was plenty of competition in rolling stock of intercity train, locomotives, metros, all of that perfectly fine. In two important markets, in very high-speed train and in mainline signaling, two things that you really need if you want to have, rail to compete with flying in a European or planetary context. Here there was very little competition left in Europe, and in these markets nothing coming from China either. And here there were solutions, but the companies could not or would not provide those solutions. So we were left with no other choice than to prohibit the merger. So it would depend on that, because our obligation when it comes to merger control is to make sure that businesses are still challenged. Businesses can be big, no problem whatsoever. Big business has been created by mergers, but they have to accept still to be challenged, because it's in being challenged that you're still good. And that is where competitiveness comes from. It's one of the most important sources of that. So that would remain to be seen. And the last question of having such a European important project, the thing that characterizes these projects is that there is a market failure, and that failure can be addressed with putting together a project with a very sort of high level of innovation inbuilt. So I don't think that would be the right tool. I completely agree that we need to push for independent media and for enabling a media reality where there's also a business case for independent media. Because we can suggest sort of media programs, support programs, but the most important thing is still that there is a business case for having independent media. Because of course support can come in many forms, but the more dependent you are on the people that you're going to criticize, well, you risk to get into a situation you don't want to be in, which is why copyright, the Digital Services Act going to come, all the things done by my colleagues to enhance democracy, and the work that we do looking at the advertising industry, that of course is of the essence. Rather than, I think, putting in place programs of this sort, because I realize, of course, that we have a lot to do to promote independent, critical media in a European context as one of the basics of our democracy.
Thank you. There is so many questions now that are coming in, so I'm trying to sort them and group them a little bit. One goes directly to you and immediately, and it's a very well kind of constructed one where we can quickly answer it. The new state aid rules that have been found for the COVID crisis to deal with it, kind of the emergency rules now, would kind of extending them for an extended period of time be actually a really great tool in leveling the playing field with China, an alternative route to doing that, just kind of making something temporary, permanent to address the China challenge?
Well, that I think would be indeed defensive. Because that would basically be just say, well, let's do the same. Let's just make sure that businesses can always rely on taxpayers to pick up. In these times, it has been 100% justified, completely legitimate, because governments have asked businesses to close their doors, and then you have no customers. So obviously, it has been needed. But it must be temporary, because what customers, businesses, and most businesses are the customer of someone else, is of course to have competitive prices, choice, innovation coming in from these sources. And I think historically, you do not have much success of massive state aid. What we have to do is of course to figure out, well, what is it that it takes for us to have our model of reasonably equal inclusive welfare societies, while at the same time being sufficiently competitive. I think that is more the way to go than to say, well, taxpayers will have to pick up, also when we come into waters that are not so decided by the pandemic.
Bildt, one question for you. I think that works well for the context here. The question is, being in China, you can clearly detect rising discrimination against foreigners, even tendency of closing its society, as well as efforts to try to utilize the EU and its member states in the great game with the US. More European strategic autonomy and an assertive approach in regard to Beijing presents itself as the only right path at the moment, awaiting the hoped for results of the US elections. Should we just sit still until November now? Should we not do too much, not rock the boat too much for the time being and wait for the US election results? What do you think?
We don't have time to wait. We have a lot to do, and no matter who wins the US election, we have to build on the relationship. As it takes two to have a good relationship, we have changed the last 4 years just as well as they have in the US. And we can waste no time in reassessing what we want to do, how we want to do, and then to put it in motion. Because the global, the geopolitics is changing. And if we want to have, I think, a fully owned, assertive place, then we cannot waste any time. I think this is indeed the time to reach out to Americans everywhere in the administration and everywhere else, because as Carl said initially, well, we live on the same planet. We need to have a relationship with everyone, but I think we need to have a very close relationship with the US, because we share fundamentals when it comes to democracy and openness and how we look at the individual. So we cannot just sit back and wait, because even though we have ties that has been built for decades and decades, all of that will have to be reconfirmed over and over and over again. So I definitely think that we should, keep talking, keep discussing, keep pushing, as for instance Phil Hogan has done in proposing a trade and technology council with our US counterparts.
Carl, would you like to come in here, please?
No, I have nothing to add. I agree with everything that Margrethe said. I mean, we can't subsidize. I mean, what we do now is absolutely imperative in order to support the recovery. But then to get out of this is going to be tricky but necessary. To take one concrete example, because it becomes easier. Governments are now pouring money into the airline industry in order to make the airlines survive. I think that's perfectly justifiable. But at some point in time, we need to go back to a situation where it's competition and the customers that decides. I mean, to take one example, I know one national carrier in Europe has been in existence in 40, 50 years and has been profitable only one of those years. And you can pour endless sums of money into that particular airline. It's not going to survive anyhow. So there need to be a restructuring also of European industry to adapt to the competitive landscape. And that means that important as these packages are now, getting into them imperative, getting out of them will be equally important for the competitive position of Europe further down the line.
And maybe another question that came here that is squarely within your foreign policy box. So to what extent is trade with China being used as a tool for foreign policy and furthering EU values, and how far can it be used to be a tool when we look at the treatment of the Uyghurs in Xinjiang or Hong Kong? Is trade a stick that we should wield?
That's always a tricky question. I happen to believe that long term, developing links is a way of sort of transforming societies. It doesn't work easy, it doesn't work short term, things go back and forth, but long term, it does have that particular effect. Short term, that is to what we do. I think we have tendency all over the world to overuse the sanctions instrument at this particular time. We have it offered as a substitute for foreign policy rather than instrument of foreign policy, because there's nothing else that we can do, and then we have sanctions, and that's sometimes counterproductive. China has very many dimensions to it, but we should not forget that it's a very important market. It is today an economy the size of the European economy. If it starts to close, say that they develop a GDP per capita in mainland China that starts to approach what Taiwan has, then their economy is going to be twice the size of the European economy. That's going to be hugely important that we are competitive on that particular market in order to be competitive in the world. No major global corporation can be global without being successful on the Chinese market. So it's a balancing act. Foreign policy is foreign policy, and commercial relationship must sometimes be somewhat different.
Then there was another question now on by Christoph Steck here in the chat. So do we need some form of digital deal in Europe, kind of like the Green Deal? We need a digital deal now because the COVID has shown us the power of public-private cooperation. And how about a deal to cover the EU with fiber and 5G networks against prolonging without costs spectrum license for operators against coverage obligations, as you had pointed out already? And how can we move forward here? Do we need the Green New Deal and the Digital New Deal simultaneously and put the same efforts behind it? Maybe Margrethe Vestager, maybe this is a good one for you.
Yes, one of the questions quite a lot because I have this very impressive title of being responsible for a Europe fit for digital age. So what does that mean? Because when you hear it the first time, you think, oh, I have to be more digital. It's the human who will have to be more digital. But we have tried to say, well, no, it's about making the best use of digital tools. The digital in itself does not provide society. It is the use of it. It's how people feel that and even though we talk about sort of twin transitions,
it's really hard. The connection is really bad.
Building infrastructure, building skills for the individual to be able to do it and to make sure the human is still in, because
it is a bit ironic that we talk about digitalization and the new digital deal and the connection is pretty bad, but I think that's where we are in Europe and this is a process. So we're just trying to deal with this at the moment. Maybe we'll wait for your connection to improve a little bit and move to one additional question that we can then give to Carl Bildt. The US comes in. I mean, the title of this session is EU-China relations in the new geopolitical realities, but quite frankly, we can't really talk about this without talking about the US as well. It is inherently a triangle. It is inherently something that is connected. So how do we deal with the kind of US policy towards China, the extraterritorial measures that are taken, the sanctions that are being, the assertiveness with which the policy is taken, that has an actual effect on us and our business and how our business can do business with China in the future? Any ideas on how we will kind of balance that in the future?
Well, I think we should develop our own approach to China, but we should also have a close dialogue with the Americans. And I was happy to note that Secretary of State Pompeo responded positively to the post by Josep Borrell the other day on having a foreign policy dialogue. I think that's necessary to have, because in terms of values, of course, the United States, the European Union, we have very much in common. But we need to have our own approach and our own policy. And that is going to be sort of dependent upon how we develop our own competitive strength. We must be more aware of the dark side of Chinese developments, of the security issues that are there with a totalitarian society, and the way in which they use instruments. We've been dealing with those issues before. I mean, some of us are still old enough to remember when we were in another competitive position with another regime that wasn't really to our liking in terms of values. But we were fairly successful in dealing with that, and we should use some of that experience at the same time as we are dealing with a far more sophisticated. And then we should hope that we could develop relationships that also long term can help with the transformation of China. The green transformation of China is something that we should try to help with, because it is, I mean, China is now roughly a third of global emissions. If they don't deal with that, it doesn't make much of a difference what we do in Europe, frankly speaking. So there we have an interest in cooperating closely with them, as the same time as being aware of the strategic competition that is there. Difference with part of the market, only part of the debate, is that some of them are under the illusion that they can, by their measures, stop China from developing, stop China from rising, and that you can decouple from China completely. I think that's an illusion, and I think it's a mistake. But I think that even the American debate will become somewhat more realistic in these terms as it goes along.
And there's another follow-up question to you here that says, can we poke Carl a bit on what the offense means? Because he was talking about the offensive measures that need to be taken. What are these? What do they look like?
Well, I mean, playing offensive is being successful. Clearly, we can discuss different aspects of it, but clearly the Chinese economic development during the last 40 years has been very impressive. Part of the development of the Silicon Valley, the digital development of the US has been extremely successful as well. We have not been as successful as them. We need to become as successful as them, or preferably even more successful. I normally say on the digital side, there are three things necessary to simplify things. We need to increase our funding in research and development. I mean, the Lisbon goal that we set 20 years ago is 3% of GDP for research and development. After 20 years, we had 2%. That's dismal. And brains go after money. Our best brains go to Stanford or Harvard or MIT if they don't have enough funding at our universities. There's nothing wrong with the brains, it's the money. Second, we need the capital, as we said. We need capital markets. If you look at the Nordic area where we have the largest numbers of a lot of good startups, but we find that in the second and third financing round, money is not available in Europe. And that's why they end up with Microsoft, to take the Skype example, or Cisco to take the Tanberg example, or whatever, because our capital markets are not sufficiently developed. And then the third factor is, Margrethe mentioned, the single market. It needs a daily care in order to be there. If we sort those three things out, I think we start to create the conditions for being successful. Then it takes time, but that's relevant.
So there was one question now that I found very interesting, because it links to topics that are kind of key and at the heart of the German Council presidency as well. It is also the dialogue with Africa, and the question of how does the EU-China relationship kind of figure in the EU-Africa relationship, or the overall relationship with Africa. And the question here was, is there something that we can do together when it comes to Africa? And this definitely has a digitalization aspect to it as well. How do we deal in the future, things that we can do together with China in Africa on development, on digitalization, on developing markets? Margrethe Vestager, are there ideas in that sense already? Because this was something that was supposed to be discussed as well at the EU-China summit. Can you hear me?
But we are very, very enthusiastic about the EU-China Africa partnership. There are unprecedented possibilities. You find in so many African countries highly skilled people, high level of digitization, use of technology, and we see a huge need to diversify our supply chain. Because now, during the COVID crisis, obviously, I think everyone saw the problems of single supplier dependencies. So a lot of things can be pushed here. We had a very successful visit. The entire European Commission traveled to meet our partners of the African Union Commission. Never been done before, that so many commissioners, including the president, was traveling at the same time outside of Europe. And that in itself was to show this is for real. we think that the EU-African partnership is of the essence here. And it was a very, very, also on substance, fruitful meeting, because we have so many things in common. And I have kept, of course, in touch with the people I met back then, because what we see when it comes to the potential of that relationship is so big. The thing is that we also have to assess how we do this. For every euro China or US partners are investing in an African country, European, the EU and member states would invest 5. And yet there is this sense that Europe is not doing enough. So we have to figure out, well, how to make that be reflected, because I think very often European funding would go to building capacity, where other kinds of funding would go to build lighthouses. Look at this amazing building. We build it, and there are Chinese flags all over, where it's very, very difficult to put a European flag and the partnership on something that is intangible, because it's in the fundamentals, it's in the infrastructure that is built up. And in order to reassess that, I think the partnership can also be much, much stronger.
Is there anything you'd like to add, Carl, on that?
No, just to salute the Commission, because I think it was a very important move done very early when Ursula von der Leyen took the entire Commission to meet the African Union Commission in Addis Ababa. It was a very strong signal. And then we all know that follow-up can be problematic, but a strong and important signal, and I hope it's followed up.
There are certainly a few bandwidth issues at the moment with following up on all the different strands that the Commission has to deal with. We are moving towards the end of our discussion, so I don't want to let you two go without being at the very start of the German Council presidency. Myself being based in Berlin and ECFR having a strong presence here, I would like to know from both of you, if you had 3 wishes to the German Council presidency, what would be the 3 things that you would really want the German Council presidency to push forward, to move forward, and to be successful with? Maybe we can start with Carl.
No, there are a number of obvious things that I already mentioned previously, sort of the Brexit mess, to prevent that from being even more messier than it already is. Then a lot of it got to be a recovery fund. My contribution could be perhaps to say that, yes, for all of the importance of the recovery fund, I would hope that one would focus not only in this year and next year, which I hope will be a recovery, but on the question, where is Europe going to be in the competitive space 5 years from now? And what are we going to do now in order to be more or less certain that we will not continue to lose out in the way that we should be realistically understand that we've been doing during the last 10, 15 years. Back to a green and digital turbo version of the old Lisbon agenda. Focus some of the mental and intellectual energies on that, in addition to the necessary needed recovery issues.
Thank you. Margrethe Vestager.
Obviously, the recovery fund and the long-term budget, because speed is worth billions here. If we can get an agreement in July so that we can get things going, that is worth billions, both economically, but also in preventing the most harsh social costs, preventing long-time unemployment with young people, everything that comes with that. So that's speed is of the essence. Second, to make member states come together. Everything we have discussed these last 60 minutes can happen if member states come together. And since it's this mixture of economic policy, foreign policy, geopolitics, sometimes that is difficult, because it could be the Council of Foreign Ministers, it could be the ECOFIN, to make member states come together to see, well, we need to do this together. And that is tricky, because there is a lot of very different interests among member states. But if they would invest in that, I think the Germans would be able to do that. Last but not least, to put or to have sort of a hands-on approach to green and digital. because we cannot wait. The planet is still by the table. We may not have spoken so much about it during the pandemic, but we also have to accelerate what we do to fight climate change. And I think for citizens to see that there is a hands-on approach, that funds are being translated into real projects, so that windmills and new electricity grids and energy saving in buildings, that all of that is happening right now. I think that action-prone approach, that would be of the essence.
And I hope that the Germans will be able to provide the right energy and action that is needed for this. There were numerous questions in the chat that would have led us down a number of other digital and tech roads and things that can be discussed and ideas that can be discussed. What we will do is save the chat definitely and come back to you with ideas and thoughts on all of this. I think one of the key aspects was raised by Andres Ortega, saying that the fact that we still have connectivity problems here shows that internet maybe should be a public good and be treated as such, so that we all can talk to each other all the time. I think we learned very well that we have the brains, but we lack the money sometimes, that we are developing the tools, but we also have to start using or start actually using them and having the courage to use them. And that the China policy issue is definitely not an issue anymore that can be nicely compartmentalized into a foreign policy box. But as you saw with our conversation, kind of being all over the place, that China is now everything. It's trade, it's tech, it's digital. It's our domestic politics, it's health policy, and it's therefore not an issue anymore that can be put to the EAS, but is to be like a cross-cutting commission approach, and that's what we're seeing at the moment. I thank Carl Bildt and Margrethe Vestager very, very much for the time that they have spent here with us and for being willing to engage. And I wish all of you a great further ACM virtually and joining us further. We have a short break now, and then we will see you all for the focus sessions in just a minute. Thank you all very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.